presentation and get that going so I can give Tavis the floor. You guys hear enough from me all the time, so I want y'all to hear from him. Okay, so we have creation stories with genealogy resources, and this will be the interview episode. Okay, y'all? So today I have the incredible opportunity to fulfill a significant wish on my journey to understand the people I come from. Throughout this exploration, educational videos on YouTube provided substantial, hello, Maya, hi, sorry, I'm gonna just post back, substantial support, particularly when I encountered gaps in available knowledge. Tavis and his mother, Renee Sanders, co-founders of Indigenous education, consistently delivered impactful, moving, and empowering content that resonated deeply with me. Content that has been available for years, y'all. Okay, like for a very, very long time. A consistent, tried, and true path of teaching. Truly, they are Indigenous education. Their insights were especially valuable as I grappled with the challenges of being an enslaved admixed individual who descends from dark skinned Indians and finding my people who were raised in an act of genocide. I'm thrilled about the chance to speak with Tavis Redtail Hawk, a wellspring of wisdom and knowledge on topics that our community often has limited access to, fostering a conversation rooted in solid facts. So I'm going to also let you all know that I'm going to pass this along to Tavis, but in this presentation, you will find all of the information in order to get in touch with Tavis and his mother. So I'm going to, here we go, make you the host and open the floor up to you. There we go.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
All right, and is my screen sharing okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. First of all, I just like to say thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Um, we've been doing this for about 14 years underneath our nonprofit, and my main objective was to share the information that my mother was opening me up to. And so I'm very thankful to hear that the information is interesting and inspired you to, do more research and to learn more. And I hope that that's what we can continue to do, to build that solidarity amongst all of the indigenous communities here. Um, just real quick, I don't know if you noticed, but I'm wearing my afro today.
Oh,
and I
snap. I love that.
yeah, I thought that would be I thought it would be a really good just a topic of discussion with the conversation we're having today, right?
Mhm.
We are talking about, American history, a part of American history that was out, nonetheless, a very, very important part to help us to identify who we are, but also, some of the ways that we might begin to repair our communities, right?
Yes.
And the dark skinned Indian has always been a topic of discussion. And for most of my life, I've been battling against the social construct that the so-called dark-skinned Indian is a myth, right?
Yep.
So we put this presentation together. We don't want to keep you long, about to jump right into it, just as a way to, start to offer individuals spaces where they will be able to develop their own information and verify a lot of this information that we're putting out. And so we can just really start from the very beginning, which is the 1500s, as a matter of fact. Now, I know that this census states that this is coming from the 18D census. However, it's talking about things that happened in the 1500s. And this particular quote, the Elon persisted in slave hunting about Beaufort, 1520, these Negroes being valuable as laborers. And I know that you're actually going to offer me an opportunity to also share this information a little bit different. And
Mhm.
so let's get into it. And I know that me and you can
Yeah.
have somewhat of a conversation on these facts that we are sharing for our audience today.
Yes, it's really exciting because I'm lucky to get to see these slides ahead of time. So I really got to meditate on these slides. And I have been lucky that I've been watching your mom and your information for like about 3 years now, I can say. And I binge watched everything. So I was able to come up with some questions. And when I saw this first one, I instantly thought about South Carolina in the 1500s. And I wanted to ask you, okay, who built
Mhm.
the antebellum homes
Yes,
and who
yes.
were the laborers?
Aha. Okay. Well, antebellum meaning pre, right? Is it's like a prefix. It's a word that has some Greek, maybe a little bit of Latin in it, but it meant homes prior to the war, right? The Civil War, or they really are referencing homes and really these grand plantation homes from the South, these colonial homes that you see all in the movies that they like to
Mhm,
elaborate. However, interesting enough, again, these homes were built before the Civil War. So these homes were built by the slaves of that region. Again, like you suggested, most of the time it was these homes are referencing homes from the South.
mhm,
And the laborers, now again, this is before 18s, right? Before the 1800s. And so the question of, well, who are the slaves is a very, very good question.
mhm,
And as you can see, even within this particular quote that we have here, that it said that in 1520, the Negroes were valuable. And so the question becomes, well, wait a second, where did the
mhm.
Negroes come from?
It's
Because
it's
you're
like they
just getting
snitched
here.
on themselves because
Yeah.
like
Now,
what was the
interesting.
time period? Sorry to cut you off. What was the time period they're saying that Africans were supposed to have first arrived?
Yeah. Well, we'll be getting into that somewhat, but it's definitely not the 1500s, right? Now, with that said, I would like to just point out two things before we get back to your question with respects to the homes. And that's that the first thing is that if it's 1520, then the description of the people of Beaufort, which happens to be where my family comes from, was of a Negro stock. And so again, like you said, they snitched on themselves. Those natives or those indigenous peoples in this region, based on this quote, based off the census, was black, was a Negro. I also would like to point out that if you are doing your research during these times, um, a lot of time you'll see that they said that they shipped Africans to the Caribbeans. However, the Africans that they are referring to were the Africans of the southeastern coast of the United States, meaning they are calling the dark skinned Indian African in the 1500s.
Yes.
And so you have to really be careful when you are deciphering history because that when you see that they shipped Africans, they are sometimes misleading you because they want you to think that the slaves came from Africa when in actuality they came from mainland United States.
That's really interesting because I do know finding my family names that were on the ship manifest, but they were being transported from places like Puerto Rico, being moved to places like Jamaica, and they were being listed as their Indian names. So it would be things like Big Caesar, Big King. And they kept being the same people, but they would call them African stock. But this was
Hmm.
in the 1500s. And the thing
Yes.
is I can't take them back to Africa, but I can take them back to their tribes. And it was almost like they were kind of like influencers of slaves in a way, where they were sought after. They were architects. They were very, very skilled. So like
Hmm.
you would see them consistently on many other people's manifests because they were sought after.
Yeah, just as this quote suggests, they were valuable as laborers. To be honest with you, a lazy slave is not a valuable slave. And so a person wouldn't purchase a slave that they knew didn't have any skill sets.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
there's a huge conversation to be had based off of that, misconception of the laziness of our people also, you
Yes,
know.
many were skilled masons, and I think the antebellum homes reflect that.
Interesting enough, to get back on to that point and to just take it back a little further than the antebellum homes, and we can talk about the tabby homes. And I also wanted to just offer that small little nugget, right?
Mhm.
Tabby homes,
And how
and
would you how
talk.
would you spell tappy for me? Like I'm going to be researching it as at home.
Yeah, yes, simply Taby.
Okay, that's so
And
cool.
yeah, and what tabby homes were made from the shell mines of our shell mounds, excuse me. Um, these were pyramidal mound structures that were made from seashells and coral and other items that the indigenous peoples would use, and they would create these monolithic structures. A
Mm,
lot of them along the coastlines, particularly in the south. Once the Europeans got here, they began to destroy these these mounds, these structures, and use the the actual mound itself, grind it up, and then use that as a foundation for their homes. It was called
wow.
tabby, and they did it a lot in a lot of their very very elaborate properties, because when the light hits the tabby, it gives off a shine and a glimmer, and sometimes even like colors. And so they would use this in the development of their properties, some mason
Wow.
properties. And so definitely, tabby homes, which are also, again, remnants of the indigenous populations from the southeast.
That's really neat. I do believe I got to see some mounds when I was in Plantation, Florida, and they they were like guarded off, like they were like sectioned off in a way. And I'm like, why are they sectioning off this hill? And somebody explains to me, they're like, it's not a hill. That is a mound. It was a gigantic mound in that particular part.
Yes, yes, interesting. Well, we do visits to mounds sometimes, and they're always a beautiful sight. But there's so much to get into. Let me move forward, and I hope that I was able to offer some information with respects to this point.
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Okay, well, again, we're talking about the Southeast United States, recognizing that, the southeastern portions of the United States actually extends from around the Philadelphia region, maybe even as far north as New York City, and then down to Florida. Um, and it's only in recent history that we consider Philadelphia, New York, and the Baltimore area part of the Northeast. Used to actually be considered part of the Southeast when referencing Native Americans. And so, we like to use facts to make our points, and it's not just the verbal history that has been being passed down in our families. But this particular quote comes from the Smithsonian Institute's 19th annual report from the Bureau of American Ethnology. If you notice, this quote is coming from page 233 of this book. We put the page number there because some people were questioning the validity of the quote. However, it's simple. A considerable portion of the blood of the Southern Negro is unquestionably Indian. And so I guess my question to you would be, what does unquestionably mean to you?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Hmm. And even here, I wanted to acknowledge that, portion of blood, these are concepts that they created. In
Mhm,
our
mhm.
communities, if you were born to one of our women, then you are a part of that community, period. And even the European admixture into our tribes was not, nobody was viewed in a negative way.
Mhm.
Well, again, there's never a 100%. But my
Yeah.
point is that this portion of blood, which eventually turns into the blood quantum, is really and truthfully how they control our identity, and how, although their books, their government, and their histories state that there was a group of dark skinned Indians that existed here, that we are not allowed to identify as that. And so, again, this is just one of those undisputed facts that individuals can use as they begin to try to wrap their minds and try to find the history of who they are, and how this might actually meet their historical record more than what they have been teaching us.
Hmm. I was going to ask you, maybe we should say to people, because me and you discussed this. You refer to yourself as a dark skinned Indian, right?
I do.
For myself, I said to you that I more so would call myself either Amerindian, or I would call myself a Black Indian. And the reason why I said that I do that is because I'm so light that I still got to claim my people. I still got to let people know which kin I came from. Um, I want to let people know because in Canada we use the term Afro-Indigenous quite frequently, and to say Afro or to separate from the Indian is an act of genocide. So I
Mm.
wanted you to talk a little bit about that before we get into my question on this slide.
Yeah, well, interesting. I agree. And again, these are concepts and terms that our colonizer has been defining, and then they're using the tactics of divide et impere, or divide and rule,
Mm,
divide and conquer, to separate our communities, and to have us have this, to have us have this difficulty with the terms when we actually are referring to the same group. you know um if you don't mind me just stating that, I have a sister that's about your complexion, and I have a brother that is darker than me, from the same mother and father, and that is how our families have been for hundreds of years.
yeah.
And so, even the so just to use families, right, and brothers and sisters, and the variations of our tone as a platform to say that, wait a second, what are we really doing here? right? Why does my sister have to feel like she has to acknowledge that, black part in order for people to understand that that's who she is? Where, for me, it's like, okay, obviously I'm brown and dark or black, depending on, where you are. So I have to make sure that you understand that, I'm Indian too,
Mhm.
so, again, I feel like that's a part of the colonials um, propaganda tool, a way for them to control the conversation.
Yeah, I really feel like that's what disenfranchised my family was my dad had a fear because, and he did not know that his dad went to a residential school. He just thought his dad ran away from an orphanage. He didn't understand the gravity of the situation. So he didn't know why my grandfather was so frightened to show people his Indian identity. He didn't
Mhm.
know that he knew like they were coming for him no matter what. Uh, he even if he looked like a black man, they still wanted him as an Indian man.
Mhm. Yeah, and we have uh I'm working on a genocide series right now, the genocide of the dark skinned Indian. And in that story, your personal family story just reminded me of one of the ways that the colonizing agent, the United States, right, committed genocide against the Lenape people was the Scalp Act, right, where they were paying people to scalp boys and children, boys and men, and then children and women, as a way to, depress that population. And so many of them, um, you know, be stopped calling themselves native so that they could live, right?
Yeah.
And now the next generation, although the people are still here, they're no longer calling themselves that because, if they did, they would have gone. 3 or 4 generations later, those stories begin to get lost, and now our peoples have to, uh, you know, relearn our history, and we have to decipher all of these, wrongs that were committed on our people, so that we can, re-educate ourselves to who we are, and then let the rest of the world know, look, this is what happened, this is who we really are, and we're a byproduct of all of these various things that happen to us, are still indigenous.
Mm, I love that. I love that. 1000%.
So interesting enough, to your point, I'm going to read this because I feel like it also, kind of wraps that up, but it allows us to move forward. And this is coming from the Indian slavery in colonial times. Again, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that, and there were Indian slaves. And as a matter of fact, the, the, the African slave institution that was developed here in the Americas was built on top of a pre-existing Indian slavery. And what they did was they stopped discussing the Indian of slavery and only perpetuated the African slavery. And again, another way for our history to be omitted, right? But, and I'm reading the quote, but when we consider that so many natives were as slaves, sharing the same conditions with the vast majority of Africans in America, we must re-examine re-civilization in early America. They, meaning the native people, received similar treatment, often were described with the similar labels. Again, remember, the indigenous peoples of Beaufort were described as Negro. right? And so Africans are described as Negroes, and if this Indian population you're also describing as Negro, again, easier way for that Indian history to be omitted, right? And it says the last part, and frequently were lumped together by law, which is a really important part. And so I guess I'll let you, throw me a
Mhm.
question here if you have.
Yeah, okay. So my one of my questions is okay. I want to ask you about the different terms that would have been used in, say, 1790, because we touched on the 1500s, but I want to ask you what is the terms that they used for natives in that time period, us as dark-skinned Indians. But I also wanted to talk about the natives that were actually sent to Europe and or
Mm.
Africa, and then were brought up to Detroit, Rhode Island, and Quebec. Those, so two separate questions. One, what was the phrase that was used? And then I kind of want to talk about the native slaves who were dark-skinned Indians and were brought to many other places. And actually, because of that, it caused many different confusions because then they were mixed even more with the African population.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we're gonna take it one step at a time, but we can take it from the beginning, right? And first thing we have to acknowledge is that during Columbus to Ponce's trips in the early 1500s and in the late 1400s, they were taking Native Americans back to Europe, and those natives were being integrated into the Mediterranean slave trade. And so, from the time of the being on this continent, whenever they went back, they took slaves back with them. And so, we just have to recognize that natives they were being enslaved from the time of their arrival, and that these um, natives, it actually makes sense because you had to prove that you arrived to these lands from Columbus' point of reference. That is, he had to prove that he had reached these new spaces, and so he had to bring back things that the king and queen were not familiar with. Oh yeah, you went to new lands. Well, what you got? Well, we got these new feathers, we got these new fruits, we got these new peoples, and look at the way that they are dressed, and look at how they are adorned. And this is actually what happened. Um, so now, as you move forward, um, in the South, we don't have a lot of history that is discussed during the 1600s because they were at war with the during the 1500s, that is, because they were at war and they were doing their best to establish colonies, and they may have had one or two, but nothing really lasted. Now comes, we into the 1600s, we're into the 1700s. We have so many different titles for the admixtures that are being created with the European and with the African and with the pre-existing indigenous population. And so they would make up terms such as quadroon. They have terms such as mestizo, which was an admixture between a Spanish and an indigenous person. Um, we have octoroon. Well, it's so many different descriptions, but the description that I think that we could talk about that would help the most was colored,
Mm.
right? And that's the term colored was a term that was given um, to Native Americans of a darker hue, right? And so when we're talking about the um, the slaves that were being transported through the Mississippi, you have to acknowledge and you have to ask yourself, well, wait a second, where did those ships come from?
Yeah, I definitely want to make mention of if you go ahead and you look up the slave narratives, for everybody out there, go check out the slave narratives, read it, because people explain what they saw when they saw these people come off the ship, and all they saw, they said, troves of Negroes. Okay,
Mm,
so take it
mm,
from there.
mm. Yeah, and the question is, well, where did the Negro come from? Recognizing that you were calling multiple peoples from multiple different continents Negro. And
Mhm,
so were we talking about an Asiatic Negro because they were calling, certain islands in the Philippines and certain tribes of South Asia, they described them as Negro. So are we
mhm.
talking about the Negroes of South Asia? Are we talking about the Negroes of Africa? Or are we talking about the Negroes of the Americas? And I don't
I
mean
think
to
that's really
um
cool. Sorry to cut you off. I was thinking about the Manila man. Like for Filipino, they would use that term as well.
right. And again, it depending on the culture and the language too. Right. And so again, just like your question reference with respects to who were being shipped to Detroit, who was being shipped to Quebec, who was being shipped to Rhode Island, Negroes. And
Mhm,
interesting enough, Rhode Island actually was one of the major exports
mhm.
um, because in Rhode Island, they were making a lot of vodka and
Wow.
alcohol, not vodka, alcohol in general, right? And so Rhode Island's colonial cash crop was liquor, and what they would do is they would send the ships to Africa to pick up the slaves. From Africa, well, actually, they would go to Europe with the barrels of liquor first. Then they would go to Africa, pick up slaves, drop the slaves off in the Caribbean islands, and they would actually trade the slaves for sugar
Wow.
because you need the sugar to the liquor, and also they would pick up slaves that have skill sets. And so the islands were more like a hub for training the slaves. And most of the slaves from Africa actually didn't come directly to the shores of the United States. And the
Mhm.
ones that did come to the United States came via the islands. And if you were um, and if you were in Rhode Island or a part of their manifest, it was because of alcohol. Where in
That's really
Virginia,
cool.
it was for tobacco. It was for the tobacco.
That's really interesting. I know when I was looking into DNA, I don't believe anything about it, but DNA, I did get family relatives pop up, and that's the only thing that I can really use it for. And one of the things was it was showing me lots of people that were Puerto Rican, and I'm like, oh my God, my grandma wasn't a liar. She's she is Taino, right? And the people, they once I started taking them back, they were Sephardic Jews that were sent over from Spain, and they were outcasted and they were exiled, and they ended up picking up slaves and going, bringing the slaves to Puerto Rico and coming back and forth, mixing the lot of them.
Yeah, and that was 50% of the reason. That was 90% of the reason why at least 50 to 60% of the European was here in America. They either
Mhm.
came as servants, they came running away from something in Europe, or they
Wow.
came because they were looking for a better situation, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
and again, like when they get here to these islands, the descriptions when they get here to the mainland in general, the descriptions of these peoples are of color. Now,
Yeah.
before we move to this side, a part of your question was, what are they being called in the 1890s? What are they calling the dark skin and brown skin Native Americans in the 1890s in the censuses of that time?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I mentioned it earlier, but they're calling them colored for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why they're calling them colored is because of the laws. And that was stated here, because frequently we were lumped together by law. And so if you were to be called, if you would say Africans and other coloreds, if you begin to research, um, uh, reading books before the 1950s, you're going to see the term colored a lot. But if you go further back, you'll see that colored was one group of people and Africans was another group of people. And
Mm.
through laws, they lumped those two groups together. And now now that the history that helps their system, which is that we are all African, can dominate, because of course we're all African, y'all brown. And that was purposely done through the centuries, through paper genocide, through classification and symbolization and discrimination.